Hi. Recently, in some of our group discussions, the topic of the security of the believer has come up. Many ex-JWs struggle with the teaching of grace, or undeserved, unmerited favor. They feel unworthy. They don't seem to notice the built-in contradiction. I owe a debt to many who ministered to me in the early years after my departure from the Watchtower, when I was wrestling with Christian teachings. Some of the help I got was through written books, some was through conversations with Christians, and others were sermons helped me a lot. One of the blessings was that my first home church minister was Victor Shepherd. I want to read to you a portion of a sermon that Victor gave in 1999 on the subject of guilt. So I've edited it somewhat. Why doesn't the church accentuate the positive? Why do we persist in the miserable prayer of confession every Sunday morning? Since guilt is burdensome, why don't we stop using the word and rid ourselves as well of everything associated with it? We don't do this for many reasons, not the least of which is this. A person with no sense of guilt is to be pitied. More to the point, a person with no sense of guilt is to be dreaded. A person with no sense of guilt is a psychopath, utterly conscienceless. Psychopaths are aware that certain behaviors are followed by the severest social sanctions. If you rob a bank, you go to jail. Psychopaths, however, have no sense of wrong. They think a jail sentence for bank robbery to be social arbitrariness, nothing more. Psychopaths can never be trusted. They are housed in a maximum security institution. The person with no capacity for guilt is the person who has to be locked up and never let out. At the same time, all of us are aware that the burden of guilt can be so very burdensome as to be crushing. When I use the word guilt, am I referring to a state or a feeling? Most people have a feeling in mind whenever they hear the word guilt. The judge in criminal court, however, has only a state in mind. When a judge declares the accused to be guilty, the judge is describing the offender's state, the offender's condition. The judge doesn't know how the offender feels and may not care. Undoubtedly, a judge often pronounces guilty offenders who don't feel guilty at all. Still, we all agree it's appropriate for someone who has done wrong to feel guilty. It's appropriate for state and feeling to match up. When people who are guilty also feel guilty, their guilt is called real guilt. When people who haven't done wrong feel guilty, nonetheless their guilt feeling is called imaginary. Suppose I feel guilty when, according to most people, there's no guilty state. I eat a piece of chocolate cake, one piece, when I'm convinced I need to lose 10 pounds. Most people would see my guilt feeling as purely imaginary, trivial even. Calling it trivial, however, does nothing to reduce the feeling. The feeling of imaginary guilt can be so very intense as to be immobilizing. How would a Jehovah's Witness feel if she received a blood transfusion? How would a Hindu feel if he ate meat? Imaginary guilt is said to arise largely from taboos we absorbed during our childhood, or from taboos acquired from our social environment, our colleagues, our friends, our parents, chiefly our parents. We move into adult life with our childhood taboo system firmly in place, and no less firmly in place for having been acquired semi-consciously. We move further into adult life with our society's taboos system in place, always aware that there are social penalties for violating social taboos. Many people are embarrassed to admit what they feel guilty about, I've found, because the taboos appears, from a rational standpoint, to be trivial. As trivial and arbitrary as they tell themselves it is, their guilt feelings remain. Not only does their guilt remain, it frequently goes ever so deep and is startlingly destructive. The question still has to be asked and answered. However, as to how we come to sort out real and imaginary guilt. On what basis do we distinguish them? Distinguishing them isn't as easy as we might first think, since both kinds are pervasively intertwined in us. Because untangling the two kinds is more difficult than expected, we are prone to pursue the quick fix of labeling our guilt as all imaginary or all real. Perhaps you think that our guilt situation is so very complex, complicated even, that we shall never find our way out of the maze. Yet we shall. We find our way out as the gospel brings us out. Jesus Christ brings us out as he comes upon us and seizes us and soaks us in his unique truth, mercy, and wisdom. In the days of our Lord's earthly ministry, his opponents hounded him, waiting to catch him infringing this custom or that code or yet another taboo. When they finally caught him, healing a man on the Sabbath, or allowing his disciples to eat without ritually dipping their hands, or befriending those that society loves to hate, they jumped on him, saying, "You've broken the rules. You've infringed the code." Our Lord's opponents think that real guilt arises when the code is violated or the custom infringed. His followers, on the other hand, know that real guilt arises inasmuch as we are guilty persons before God. While sin is something I do, at the bottom, sin is something I am. The sin that I do is but the fruit of the sin that I am. In the presence of Jesus Christ, Peter doesn't exclaim, "Oh my gosh, I've done the wrong thing." Rather, he cries, "Depart from me, for I am a sinful man." Opponents of Jesus compared themselves against a list of rules and note that they break 50% of them. If ever they begin to feel guilty about this, they console themselves with the fact that they break only 50%. This means they keep 50%, and the man down the street manages only 40%. Disciples of Jesus, on the other hand, recognize with Peter that the code mentality is entirely besides the point. Followers of Jesus know that their proximity to him discloses not something they've done here or there wrong. Their proximity to him discloses them, discloses themselves in their person to be in the wrong before God. Depart from me, for I am a sinful man. The Apostle Paul adds, all have sinned and lack the glory of God. The characteristic human deficit which deficit is as deep in us as blood poisoning, is that we lack the glory of God. We were created in it, and it is meant to characterize us. It doesn't now. We lack the glory of God, all of us equally. All of us lack such glory equally, despite the unequal attainments we undeniably display. All of us lack the glory, God's glory, which glory is the human good, despite the different degrees of virtue, which more moral and less moral people exemplify. Yes, we all lack the glory of God equally. The spiritual predicament of humankind, in other words, the predicament plain and simple, isn't that we do this or that wrong. Our predicament is that we are in the wrong before God. The first impact the gospel makes upon us is to disclose our spiritual condition. So at the beginning, he talked about this prayer of confession. Well, that was something new to me as an ex-witness. When I was a witness, we did not have weekly group prayers of confession. We weren't supposed to be doing anything wrong, so we did not develop the habit of confession. We did feel guilt, though, but usually it was tied to not doing enough. And if we broke the rules with serious sins, then we felt guilt. We did not talk, though, the New Testament language of being sinners. As Jehovah's Witnesses, we felt our spiritual condition was safe through association with the organization. And an awareness of my spiritual condition, I am a sinner, alludes more than just Jehovah's Witnesses. I learned that some in our church did not think that they were sinners. They presumed that this talk was hyperbole. The first step for me was a reality check. I am a sinner. The Jews had a perfect law that they could not keep. They were sinners. The non-Jews had their conscience, which taught them to identify right and wrong, but they could not live up to it. They were sinners. We're all sinners. Next time I'll continue Victor's sermon. I wanted to link here 2 videos. One is called JW's and Org Confessional. Is the issue serious sins or sin? And that was based on a conversation David and me had about a section from Ray France's book, In Search of Christian Freedom. The second video, based on David's readings from James Orr, one of his books, was Reconciliation. When we were enemies, Christ died for us. The God who seeks sinners.